Welcome to Modern Anarchy, the podcast exploring sex, relationships, and liberation. I'm your host, Nicole.
I tried to keep her quiet, but she's screaming inside of me. I tried to keep her hiding, oh, shut up. I tried to keep her quiet, but she's a wild, wild woman.
On today's episode, we have Dr. Adele Lafrance. Join us for a conversation about examining mother blame. Together, we talk about healing from internalized patriarchy, navigating the Madonna and the horror complex, and integrating the political need for pleasure. Hello, dear listener, and welcome back to Modern Anarchy, episode 150? Oof! How exciting. How exciting, right? There was definitely a big celebration at 100, and I was thinking, do we celebrate 150? That feels like the, year and a half celebration, or that's somewhere in between, but I think it's important, once I start hitting the 300s, the 400s, the 500s, the 700s, and on in infinity until I leave this earth. We will celebrate the 150 today because that's a really big milestone. And dear listener, I am so happy that you have been on this ride with me and continue to tune in each Wednesday to hear more of these powerful conversations, these pleasure activism conversations that are changing hearts and minds. So thank you for tuning in. And today's episode, we talk a lot about mother blame, but of course, this is also important to any sort of parental relationship and attachment. That being said, there are very specific cultural narratives, expectations around motherhood and women and what it means to be in that role. So we're going to be talking about that today, but also taking that larger context to the ways that society does or doesn't include other people in these sort of traditional roles, right? All of you queer families out there challenging these norms, I love you. I support all of my relationship anarchists that are building expansive networks that completely change the whole expectation of the mother-father nuclear family. I am so excited to be a part of communities that are really changing the narratives because no matter what you're doing, we are not meant to raise children just in a dyad of the nuclear family. We are meant to raise children in community, right? In an expansive network of multiple relationships to help to raise a child. And yet, the field of psychology has absolutely been complicit in placing that blame for the child's development on the mother. And that's a lot of what Adele Lafrance talks about today is, okay, sure, we are impacted by our relationships, but what is the larger societal systemic framework to understand what the mother was going through, right? We talk a lot on this podcast about systems and how they impact us. And when we talk about that, that doesn't negate our individual responsibility to examine, reflect, grow, take responsibility for our actions, right, under those systems. But we do also have to place the blame on the systems as well and not just the individual. It is a yes and. And so that is a whole part of the conversation in psychology that has been completely left out for mother blame, right? What sort of societal context were these women in? My mom, she graduated with a high school diploma, right? Her parents told her as a woman, why would you ever need to go get a degree beyond that? So that impacts who my mother is and how she shows up in the world and her understanding and perspectives because of that lack of education, right? I was super thrilled to be the first person in all of my family to get an undergraduate degree and now to be almost done with my doctorate. What a wild world. But that's something to take into context when I think about my own mother blame, right? And where she's at and how that impacts her. And I think about my grandmother never graduating high school, right? Thinking about my maternal side coming from Poland during the Holocaust to America. How did that impact their availability to be in relationship with their children? I think about my grandma on my paternal side. She had my aunt at 14 years old, single mom at 14, and my dad at 16 years old. How do we think that that impacted her and her ability to be a mom? And I think about my grandmother dying of liver failure in her early 40s from chaotic use of alcohol. And to think that we live in a country where there are specific states, if you're in America, where you will be forced to carry and have a pregnancy. Forced. No bodily autonomy. In 2018, when I got pregnant, I had the privilege of accessing an abortion so that I would not be forced into motherhood at 21. Just getting out of college and knowing that I wanted to go get my education and my doctorate and be able to have the freedom to one day, if I choose, to create life in this world, to do it when I was ready. So many people do not have that freedom that I had to choose motherhood or not. Yeah, these are all parts of the systems that are impacting motherhood. No bodily autonomy, no universal health care, no 1 year of maternity leave like they do in Canada and Adele talks about. I mean, long career here, y'all. Long career ahead of me. So with that being said, I think I'm going to go call my mom, tell her I love her, and continue to invest in that relationship and the ways that it's expanded over the years. And I hope that all of you, dear listeners, take a moment to integrate an understanding of how these systems are impacting us. Whether it's your mom, someone else that holds that relational parental figure place for you, let's take a deeper dive into the ways that society is impacting all of us. And with that, I am sending you all of my love, and let's tune into today's episode. So then the first question I like to ask each guest is, how would you introduce yourself to the listeners?
Gosh, I would introduce myself to the listeners. That's a really good question. I mean, a human.
That's a good place to start.
Yeah, who is trying to figure out how to be in this world and resist engagement in some of the really old structures that I have learned were not so good for me. I think that's really what I'm focusing on, is like reclaiming myself. So a human in process of reclaiming myself.
Yeah, lifelong journey, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I'm excited too today. I know we're going to be talking about mother blame. So I'd be curious, where does that journey start? Where do you want to take me and the listeners today in terms of mother blame?
I mean, it started off when I was pretty young.
Yeah.
And I had feelings of blame towards my mother, at different times. And then that was definitely reinforced in grad school. I'm a psychologist, and I completed a PhD in school and child clinical psychology. And when I learned about attachment theory, wow, that was interesting. I mean, when I look back on attachment theory now, I'm like, that is a structure of oppression. That whole theory and the way that it's talked about, at least in the academic books that I was exposed to, it was really, really focused on moms and what they were doing or not doing to negatively affect their child's well-being. And I drank that Kool-Aid, like I felt like I approached it in a more loving, compassionate way than perhaps some of our forefathers. And I do emphasize the word fathers, but it was like, yeah, what the mom's doing or not doing can have a big impact. And, then I started learning family therapy, and I started working in eating disorders, where historically there is a very long and sketchy history of parent blame, and in particular mother blame. Like decades ago, they used to do what's called parentectomies. So they would remove teenage girls from their parents/mothers, treat them in hospital settings so that they could heal from the toxic influence of their parents. Yeah, this was not that long ago. So the field of eating disorders is a very fascinating field, because not that long ago, a group of mothers came together and basically said, enough is enough, stop blaming us. And there was a treatment model that actually came out that was really clearly and explicit in its message that eating disorders, the origins, they were agnostic, in terms of their origins. There was no blame, et cetera, et cetera. So that really shaped me, honestly. I interacted with some of those parents/mothers as that advocacy group, and they really impacted me quite a bit. But it wasn't until I started engaging in psychedelic medicine for my own healing that it really started to shift in terms of not just my understanding of mother blame, but also my total commitment to do what I can in this lifetime to neutralize mother blame, and quite the opposite, help people to understand what might be going on for real.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing. And I'd love to hear if you'd share about your own personal experience then with psychedelics, what it was that opened that up for you, and where it took you.
Gosh, there are so many. There's so many ceremonies. It probably really started very deeply when I was working on letting go of internalized patriarchy. So that's when I was engaged in a medicine journey one night with ayahuasca, and the medicine said to me, I'd been working on internalized patriarchy for a while, like internalized sexism.
Sure.
And the medicine said to me, do you want to completely heal from internalized patriarchy? I'm like, well, yes, of course I do. You want to go all the way? Yes, I want to go all the way. Forgive your mother.
Oof.
And forgive your mother to the point where forgiveness is actually not even a concept that is relevant for the situation. That it's such a deep level of understanding and of compassion and of love.
Yeah.
That the concept of forgiveness almost feels like an aggressive act. And I'd already done a lot of work, understanding my mother's different struggles and like everything she overcame, which is honestly like so amazing.
Yeah.
But that night, it wasn't just about my mother. It was like all mothers, and I was thinking back to my graduate school textbooks, autism and refrigerator mothers, parentectomies and eating disorders, and family dysfunction and addiction, et cetera, et cetera. And so I realized, it's true that when moms aren't able to be there for their kids, when life givers aren't able to be there for their kids, that it can have a negative impact. But what was missing from those textbooks, and what I feel is really important, is for us to ask ourselves, why? why is this mother unable to be there for her children in the way she needs, she wants, she deserves, and in the way their child, needs, wants, and deserves? What's going on and what's been going on for these, I don't know how many years, honestly. Yeah. So like that question has been really at the forefront of my mind, not because it's hard to answer that question. It's actually very easy to answer that question, but that's where the question should be at the forefront of all of our minds. Like, our culture does not do enough to support life givers. And then when they aren't able to be there for their children, we blame them. Like, it's the biggest mind fuck that I can think of, honestly, when it comes to how women are treated, how life givers are treated. I was healing from an addiction recently. So I was addicted to nicotine for many years, and then I quit overnight with ayahuasca. Like, I mean, it was amazing. I can't even believe it. Like, you don't hear about that all the time. And I was just lucky enough to be one of those people. And so I remained, nicotine free for many, many years. And then I had a relapse when I started working with tobacco ceremonially, which was so embarrassing, like to end up abusing a ceremonial substance, like a medicine. Oh my gosh. Wow. So I did a deep dive to heal myself from that addiction. And I really had to heal from the inside out. Like, I was not going to try any of the behavioral strategies. I had no interest in them. I wanted to heal from the inside out. And it took me on, a number of different journeys. I went to Peru a few times before I was able to completely heal that addiction, which is a miracle. But it showed me how the women of my lineage, those who came before me, also had addiction patterns, and that their addiction patterns were 100% to protect them from the pain of oppression and the pain of either real or potential violation. So my grandmother, for example, she was heavily addicted to nicotine. She died of nicotine-related heart disease. And I remember seeing her in a ceremony chain smoking while she was watching Days of Our Lives.
Classic.
Yeah. And also The Price is Right.
Yeah.
Because I mean, that's when I would have been home from school when those shows aired. Anyways, and it showed me how when she hauled on those cigarettes, it helped her to engage in this life without being allowed to get a driver's license, and without being allowed to work, and without being allowed to have all manner of freedoms.
Yeah.
And so chain smoking and watching The Price is Right saved her. And I had such respect for nicotine, for tobacco. And so what happened, well, according to the medicine, I believe it, what happened was that nicotine got encoded as a protective, as a medicine. And so when it came down to me, I tried my first cigarette when I was, 12 or 13 years old, out of her pack, I would add secretly. Sure. She did not give it to me. She did not want that for me. Oh my God.
Yeah.
She would have been crushed if she would have known. I had the genetic predisposition for it because my body registered nicotine as a helper. And so it really helped me to redefine genetics of addiction. I'm like, my mind was blown.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when my grandmother died when I was 16 years old, I was devastated.
Yeah.
She was the most kind, warm, loving woman to me, for sure. And I remember when we were talking about her funeral, they're trying to figure out what song to play.
Mm.
And I remember suggesting to my mom Amazing Grace, because I was really into country, and Leanne Rimes had just put out this like phenomenal rendition
Yeah.
of Amazing Grace. I'm like, oh, what about Amazing Grace? And my mom was like, oh, well, that's not really appropriate for the circumstances of Nanny's death, because, she died suddenly. And usually, you play that song when someone has had like a really long, hard fought illness, like finally, it's over kind of thing. And I was like, yeah, that made sense. And so we ended up playing some other song. But then I had this ceremony recently, and I saw like, oh, no. That song was 100% appropriate in terms of like the recognitions of the shackles that she wore for her entire life. And in that ceremony, I felt like I was engaging spiritually with my grandmother. And I made a promise to her that nobody would ever dream of playing that song at my funeral, that I was going to do whatever it took on behalf of my maternal lineage, or my female lineage, not just maternal, paternal as well, to break free, break free from the internalized structures, find freedom or breaks from the externalized structures, and then to speak up as much as I could, to help other people too.
Such a powerful story. Thank you for sharing so openly and so vulnerably with me and all the listeners.
My pleasure.
Yeah. It reminds me a lot of, I've talked about this on the podcast before, the research with Rat Park, right? About just the ways that, these patterns that we have, the relationships to drugs, are so created by the cage that we're in, right? And being able to hold that perspective when we're thinking about drugs and our relationship to them, I think is so crucial, because then it's about the frame, right? Are we placing the blame on the individual, or are we placing the blame on the larger perspective, right? The systems that are happening and causing these things. And the amount of times I've had, clients come into my room and, they're like, oh, I'm so stressed out. I'm so stressed out. And they're working 3 jobs to just survive under capitalism, right? And then a therapist comes in and says, you have anxiety, and puts the blame on you, rather than, hey, it's really not fair. This system is messed up in a multitude of ways, right? And so I think so much of this conversation then is about the frame, right? Like, what were women experiencing that resulted in these situations, rather than placing it onto the mother blame, right?
Oh, absolutely. Like, I'm going to be doing a keynote presentation in a few months, and I've been thinking a lot about what I was going to talk about. And one of the things I want to talk about is the oppression of psychology.
You're on the right podcast.
And I'm like, I'm a psychologist. I'm like, what mind trick was happening for me to be like, you know what? I think I want to dedicate my professional career to being a psychologist. And now here I am. And I'm like, okay, well, shoot. And also, I'm going to see what I can do to bust it up, from the inside. And I can just think about like, oh my God, there's so many examples. And for women, people of color, people from marginalized communities, there's so many examples. I mean, it's incredible and also tragic. And when I think about like parent blame in particular, it's another form of oppression. They have not been supported to mother in the ways that they know are necessary. They do their best with sometimes extremely limited support and resources. And like I said earlier, when it comes to light that it wasn't enough, they're blamed by systems, by clinicians, by educators, by the general public. And worst of all, by themselves and by their children too. And when I offer supervision to individual psychotherapists, I do get a little discouraged on how singular the focus can be on the people's childhood. Mother blaming is 100% a strategy of oppression, of power over culture designed to hide the lack of support that life givers are receiving, that they are continued to be denied their rights and identity as people. And it's like, like white supremacy, the most potent strategies of oppression end up becoming integrated without our awareness. And that's definitely what happened to me on both counts when it came to mother blame and when it came to white supremacy.
Yeah.
So it's been quite a journey of like, holy shit, I got a lot of work to do. And oh my God, thank God I'm awakening to this.
Yeah. Yes. I know. That's where I've been and during schooling, because I think that I've been in spaces like where I'm training, where I think Jeff, right, and other team members and stuff who have these larger system perspectives. And so having that enlightenment process during training has been an interesting experience where I'm just like, this field is really, really scary when you think about it, right? I mean, you go into it thinking that you're going to help people, and you do, right? That's the reality, is you do help people. There's a lot of helping going on, but there's also a lot of abuses of power. And I think that when we fall asleep to that, scary things happen with this level of power in our society.
Oh yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
100%. Like one last anecdote related to that, when I was healing from my nicotine addiction.
Yeah.
When I was at the very end of it, like just about to let it go, I saw that my nicotine addiction was a gaslighter, a self-gaslighter. And like, think about it, like literally.
Yeah. The lighter. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Literal gaslighter, because nicotine helped me to numb out, not just from pain and suffering, which so many people talk about when it comes to addiction, but also from expressing the fullness of my being as a woman.
Say more. I'd love to hear that.
Yeah, it was like, I had this vision. In another medicine journey, I saw that like I come from a lineage of dandelions. And at first I was so offended because dandelions are considered weeds. And in French, which I'm a French speaker, one of the commonly used name to reference a dandelion is pissenlit, which is wets the bed. But it's like not a nice way of saying like pisses the bed. Like, oh, I'm like, oh my God, I come from a line of dandelions. Gross. And then I learned that no, dandelions are incredible medicinal plants. They're extremely hardy, resilient, and brave, Anyways, so I have this vision a couple years ago. And then when it comes to this idea of like the nicotine being a gaslighter to prevent me from full expression of self, I see myself as a dandelion unfurling, just about to bloom, but being terrified to bloom, because once I would bloom, then I would become more vulnerable to attack from the systems that do not want strong women to bloom. And so I was in this like curled up position physically even, and the medicine was like, what are you going to do? Because no one will have any right to judge you if you decide not to bloom, to stay safe under the radar, because there are risks, real risks, and women have died in the thousands, in the millions, for having taken that risk to bloom. Yeah. So there was no like right or wrong answer, which I really, really appreciated. And I was just like curled up thinking, okay, what do I do? What do I do? Looking around, thinking about my environment, thinking about the garden that I've been able to cultivate, in my life. And then I just had this sentence come in: might as well bloom. Might as well bloom. And if I get cut off at the head, metaphorically, I'll have enjoyed the almost miraculous process of the bloom.
Yeah.
But a big lesson was not only not to judge people who make the choice not to, because the fear is too great, but to be there for them and to offer them validation and support, because there's so many of our sisters in this world who, if they were to make the choice to bloom right now, their lives would end, not metaphorically, but
Right.
actually,
Right.
so it was this like, it was a major recognition of like our current reality, which is way better than it used to be. We have so much to celebrate. I
Oh,
don't know if
yeah.
that's the right word, be relieved about,
Mm-hmm.
because it was always our right to be. And also, we still have a long ways to go here in North America. And there are so many of our sisters, who still need our help.
Yes, certainly. Yes. And you might find it funny. Jeff has this mural on his wall where it's literally a dandelion. And then
Oh,
I know, yeah. And then there's an Adrienne Marie Brown quote about the strength of that. And then clients get to come on after their experience and draw a little seed flowing off into the wind, without their name for that. So it was resonating when I was hearing that. I was like, yeah, there's
whoa.
a lot of power in that, right? In the story of that. And I'm just thinking about, for me, I came into the field of psychology based on doing some volunteer work for sexual assault survivors. And so I came in wanting to do that sort of work of like, okay, like let's figure out how I support people and what I could do in this space. And then I got to the field and started training in my school and got zero training on sexuality at all, which was shocking. And so then I've done a lot of my own research and focus with my dissertation in that area of study. And in terms of women and owning our sexuality, I mean, that is a whole thing that it's dangerous to bloom in so many different ways. And particularly we can name that for mothers specifically, right? To walk that paradigm of the Madonna and the whore and whatever, combination of that as a mother is particularly difficult.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Teach me something, because I'm still very internally oppressed. I'm still
Yeah,
very much oppressing myself.
for sure.
Like I'm so excited to hear that you're doing that work. Because my girlfriends and I, when we talk about our relationship to sexuality and sexual intimacy and our bodies, like we really hope that the younger generation are able to be less burdened.
Yeah.
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 So thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah. It's interesting. I think that we need models, right? Like where do we get models for that? And when we look to media and or our own family dynamics, we don't really see that embodiment of both. So it's kind of hard to turn to find any sort of example to replicate or to step into. And without that, we're kind of left on our own.
Oh my gosh. And
Okay.
honestly, it's really hard to feel sexy when you are caring for young children, working full time, and carrying significant emotional labor. Like,
Yeah.
oh my gosh. Oh, I'm tired just thinking about it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oof.
Yeah, you need mirrors where you're able to be seen in your erotic self, right? And I think that if you're only caretaking, those relationships are not naturally going to mirror that part of yourself. And so where do you find that outlet? Is it taking that pole dancing class where you can go into that and feel into that space?
Mhm.
Or is it reading a book and seeing yourself reflected in a potential narrative? I really feel like you said, we started earlier, the systems have created a world where there's not even time or space to invest in that level of selfhood for mothers, right? So where is the time to even do that when we navigate under these systems?
Oh my gosh, right? Like I was so shocked when I moved from Canada to the US
Mm.
and I heard people talking about the length of their maternity leaves.
Yeah, do you want to speak to that difference to maybe a listener
I
who doesn't
mean,
know the difference?
in Canada, it's typical for moms to take a year off, and employers subsidize that income. And there's also government programs to subsidize income, not 100% for the whole year, but I think it's 80%. I could be wrong, but it's like so many women have the opportunity to take 1 year off. And at the end of the year, like the common reaction is like, oh gosh, it still feels too early. It still feels too early. And I moved here.
Yeah.
And my partner at the time was talking about how one of his employees was pregnant and going to be off for a while. And then he was talking about her engagement in this project that was like just a few weeks later, like 6 or 7 weeks later. I'm like, excuse me, what? 6 weeks? How is that even physically possible? Like, I couldn't believe it. And then it's like, okay, 6 weeks, 3 months. Like, even those who I know in the US who have like relative privilege, 3 months was the max. And then there's all this internalized belief about whether that's long enough or not. I'm like, oh my God. We have some work to do to support life givers.
Yeah. Lots of work.
Yes, that's kind of shocking.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important thing is that sometimes when we're in our own frame, we don't even realize that other countries are doing it in different ways, right? And able to supply that. And so it can be such a shocking thing, even just I was talking on another episode about Portugal and the way that they've decriminalized a lot of substance use and how they have some of the lowest rates of overdose and death, right? And yet we live in this model in America where that's not what we're doing, and we're trying to, figure it out. And then you see these other countries. I mean, even the universal healthcare, right? Like we see other countries doing that, and then America having some of the like lowest, worst health outcomes. I think that perspective is really important to kind of like shake up the system and realize that, oh, it doesn't have to be this way.
Yeah, no, it doesn't have to be this way.
Yeah, I know.
It doesn't have to be this way. That is very true.
And so we have that, and then on top of that, mother blame, right? So we're adding those together, where then it's like, okay, and it's my mom's fault. Now, my question is like, how do you're talking about supervising other clinicians. How do you support people in holding the nuance that obviously our attachments and our parents really do significantly impact how we show up in the world and how we interact in relationships without it going to this place of such intense blame?
Yeah, well, okay. I would say there are at least 2 methods.
Yeah.
That I, employ, encourage in my work, include in my model, emotion-focused family therapy. The first is redefining attachment and redefining attachment as an act of social justice. So it's not just about psychoeducation. Attachment is not just about attachment to the mother. It's about attachment to the mother who's attached to the community, who's attached to nature, who's attached to the land where they come from, who's attached to spirituality. That's attachment. And so I think about it as like a chain link. Mom and child are attached. And then if you see that the mom, the community is not attached to mom or nature, or, then you don't start to wonder like, oh, what's wrong with mom? You're like, hello, community, why aren't you linked to this mom here who needs it? So reconceptualizing the definition of attachment to be more accurate and in a way that makes it very clear that it's not the mother's responsibility to promote, this kind of attachment. And then the second piece, this is where it gets a little tricky. Self-blame is considered to be a cognitive and emotional strategy for self-regulation. So if I had a group of moms sitting in front of me and I said to them, I have a magic potion that you can drink, and you, on the other side of it, you will no longer blame yourself for the difficulties that your child has faced, whether they're medical, physical, behavioral, psychological, whatever. Based on my work with mothers, you would find that most, if not all mothers, at least to some degree, would be really, really excited to be unburdened in that way. And also, most, if not all mothers would have a little part inside of them that would be worried about letting that go. And so I did some clinical investigations in terms of the drivers of self-blame.
Yeah.
And there are quite a few. Blaming oneself is a way of honoring our child's suffering, being in it with them, so to speak. It's also a way that we convince ourselves that we won't screw up like that again. So preventing future recurrence. And so sometimes parents who blame themselves for their child's difficulties are conflicted about letting go of that self-blame, healing that self-blame, because they're still scared, that if they don't have that self-blame, that somehow they or their child will continue to be at risk. And so I've learned that reassuring self-blame is not the most effective strategy. In fact, it can deepen mother blame. So I was doing a workshop years ago, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago. And I was addressing the concept of mother blame. And it was an eating disorder intervention, 2 days with parents. And I was, first off, I was like, I just want you to know eating disorders are complex, multifactorial,
Right.
Clinical presentations. No one here is to blame. And I was really being kind of intense about it because I wanted them to feel it. I figured if I was intense that it would penetrate.
Yeah.
Anyways, after that piece, there was a break. And one of the parents, a mom, got up, grabbed her coat, grabbed her purse, looked really upset, and started to walk out the door. And so I followed her and I said, is everything okay? And she looked at me and she said, you don't know what I did.
Oh.
That was the beginning of a research program and clinical investigations to understand how best to neutralize parent self-blame, because reassurance, including like giving the facts, was not helpful for her. If anything, she felt further away from me. She felt like I didn't understand her because she knew that there were some things that she did or didn't do or said or didn't say that had a negative impact. And so when I was like, oh, it's not your fault, it's not your fault, it felt thin, it felt off point.
Yeah.
And it felt like she couldn't trust me.
Yeah. And
so now when I teach, when I give workshops on helping people to transform parental self-blame, I talk about how important it is to validate their experience. Like I can understand why you blame yourself because you saw the look on her face when you made a comment about her weight. You remember that when you did this, this happened, So helping them to see that you do understand where they're coming from. And then when they feel understood, when they feel validated, which is essentially what we're doing, then when we offer that new perspective, they will have the openness, the flexibility, or at least more so, to be able to see it from your perspective.
Yeah.
Thich Nhat Hanh talks about deep listening.
Powerful.
Yeah, like the medicine of deep listening. And so here it's like, it's not exactly deep listening because it's like deep validation, but deep validation as a way to help. It's almost like I picture like really gently, gingerly taking them out of a mousetrap, or like the jaws of life. Like I picture like grips and like claws, it's like, ooh, let's gently do this. So I'm going to validate your experience. Yes, I see. I hear what you said. I hear what you did. Oh my gosh, that memory must be incredibly painful because of, the impact that you saw that it had or that you feared that it had.
Yeah.
And then once that process feels complete of really, really witnessing their story of pain and suffering, then that's when it's appropriate to say, like, it wasn't your fault.
Yeah.
Who wasn't there for you? It did not start with you. Right. So it's a slow, gentle, but powerful process.
Yeah. And I think it's important and powerful to have these conversations on a public, free platform, right? Like a podcast, because I think my big dream of a revolution, and I don't think it will happen in our lifetime, but certainly in some future, would be that the field of psychology is dismantled and we could come back into community care for one another, where the skills that we learn of how to help one another could be put back into community like it was, before the field of psychology. So I think it's
Mhm.
important because when we have loved ones in our life who come to us saying like, yeah, I did this, I did that. And of course we want to help them. We want to bring them to that space of seeing it in a different way. But if we come back like you're saying and just say, no, you didn't, it's not your fault, it's not your fault, the brain doesn't even take that in. It immediately goes back to the
No.
defense of like, but you're not seeing, you're not getting, you're not this, right? And so being able to learn the skills of how do we actually listen to one another to support ourselves and our
Yeah.
community, I think is so important to have conversations like this, talking about that process, which is, God, a process of patience.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah.
Right?
And you have to be able to tolerate some discomfort. Absolutely, and how important it is not just to be in our advocate mode, around mother blame. Because imagine if your mother or my mother came to me and said, that thing that happened when I said this, when I did that, it's not my fault. Like that doesn't go well. It's true, but it doesn't go well, for the child. And so what I do feel like the field of psychotherapy, whether it's psychology or mental health social work, who cares?
Yeah.
Like something new. I really support your vision. That we help parents, and in particular moms, because that's who I'm dedicated to in this lifetime, hold the big picture, that in the grand scheme of things, when they look at the last 3 generations of their families' life and all of the economic, political, social, cultural, religious influences that shaped the parenting practices in their lineage, that it is not their fault.
No.
And also that armed with that knowledge, rooted in their heart, they can also lean towards their children and help them to heal their pain, unburdened by that narrative of self-blame. And in the treatment model that I developed, emotion-focused family therapy, there's a whole module called therapeutic apologies, where we support parents and caregivers to craft and deliver therapeutic apologies to their children to validate their child's pain, in terms of having been wounded by the systemic forces that impacted their parents. But one of the criteria of being able to engage in that therapeutic apology is that the parent or caregiver, we do not allow parents and caregivers to engage in that therapeutic apology if they have moderate to severe self-blame. Because if they have moderate to severe self-blame, engaging in a therapeutic apology risks reinforcing their inner narrative of self-blame, because they can't keep it separate enough.
Yeah.
And then the self-blame gets infused into the apology, and then it's not effective, for the child, no matter the child's age. And so if the parent rates their self-blame, moderate to severe, then we first do preliminary work to help reduce their experience of self-blame. And we use cognitive strategies, we use emotion-focused strategies, we use activism, all of it.
Yeah.
To help them to kind of cool the flames of their self-blame so that they can hold both. And wow, the parents who end up doing this, they are rock stars for their lineage. They are turning things around.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
It's so cool. It's so empowering. It's one of my favorite things to do.
I can imagine why. And what I feel like I'm hearing then is this nuance, right? Of it's not self-blame, and when I'm always talking about the systems, people have come back to me and say, well, you can't just blame the systems because then there's no responsibility for what you've done. What I'm hearing is this nuance of the yes and, right, to both, and the
Mm.
ways that those are interacting to create the scenarios. And so in that, having compassion for ourselves and also taking that responsibility in a balanced, nuanced way.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's also like just the theory of pain.
Mm,
If a child is in great distress, they're focusing on their pain. Their pain is getting their attention because that's what pain does.
yeah.
Pain is there to wake us up, to get our attention so that we are focused on the pain so that we can do whatever we need to do to relieve the pain. So when kids, teens, adult children are focused on their pain, they just are not neurobiologically able to also hold that big picture.
Yeah.
So once the parent soothes their pain, from that more individual relational perspective, and then that pain heals and reduces in its intensity, organically, the adolescent or adult child, organically, they look around and be like, oh, well, it wasn't your fault.
Yeah.
There was a lot going on. And that's one of the really cool things that we've seen with the therapeutic apologies intervention
Yeah.
is that when parents are able to offer this really, deep therapeutic apology, that in the end, so that even when the adult child is like furious with them and has been furious with them for years, in the end, the marker of like all the way success is when the adult child goes, I see why you did it. It makes sense to
Yeah.
me.
Yeah.
I can see it
Yeah.
wasn't your, but it's just a process. Like, and
Right.
pain makes us focus on our pain.
Yeah, for good
We're limited
reason.
as humans. Yeah.
Right. And that's how we survive, right?
That's how we survive.
Exactly. And so having compassion for ourselves, because that's what we have to do to survive. And I'm thinking about like my own experience with my mother and the ways that, she's always done her best, right? And a few years ago when I had came out to her as queer, it was, she comes from a Mormon background. And so as you can imagine, it was, I'm
Mm,
so deeply afraid. This is so wrong. Didn't talk to
yeah.
me, right? All of the
Mm,
things. The
I'm
place we're
sorry.
in, yeah, it was a time. The place that we're in now is significantly better, right? There's been years of conversation and connection, and so much so, and it's probably also because, the way that I research sexuality is based in, academia. So I get a little bit more space to talk about things these days with
Right.
care and respect. But yeah, what I think is interesting is, you have these experiences where, someone that your caregiver, your lover, and it, any relationship, parent or not, where you get so hurt. And again, if we're talking about adaptive strategies, right, it's to pull
Yeah.
away, to protect oneself, and
Yeah.
to pull back. And so the amount of times that I've been able to cognitively put that, she's apologized now, I put that frame of reference of, she comes from a Mormon lineage, this is a different generational experience, all of that, but yet I can still feel it in my body, the
Yeah.
turning inward of hunch of not being able to fully open up and just trust again. And so I'm curious what you say to that, and particularly when you were talking about your own ayahuasca experience, right? Of what does it mean to forgive your mother? Like, how have you gone through that process of actually
Mm.
opening back up to really love when we've been really hurt by these people?
Well, that's why we have to be very discerning
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
because blooming does come with risks depending on where we find ourselves in the natural terrain.
yeah,
And so I want to, like, it's a privilege to be able to bloom and not be afraid. Not everyone has that or has access to that. And so I would be remiss to say, like, oh, yeah, just go for it, be
sure,
yourself, da da
yeah,
da da da. I'm
yeah,
like, that's not true for all peoples.
right,
So it's a continuous process of discernment and making choices on the basis of that discernment and creating spaces where it can feel safe. I think about that. Oh, what's the name of that flower? It blooms in the daytime and then
A lot of them do that, right?
really? Well, there's one in particular that I just know about because it was on my fence and I was felt so excited
For sure.
that it bloomed in the morning and then it would close back in the night. And I thought, wow, that's how I am.
For sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Like I'll bloom in certain settings and then, oh, I'm going to close up those petals and protect my core because it's still not safe in all settings to do that. So as much as I would love to, just like be yourselves always unapologetically,
Mhm.
I recognize that is a position of privilege that not all of us can afford. How to heal from that, that deep resentment? Well, I've spent the last 7 years of my career developing interventions to help people to do that in individual therapy in a way that maintains honor for the parent and the child, So I'm really proud of that. I'm really, really proud of that. And there are other modalities of healing where the manner of healing respects the family plant, not just the flower in psychotherapy. Indigenous traditions, I feel, have been able to preserve this far more. So we have a lot to learn from Indigenous traditions around not just the conceptualization, but also the tending to these kinds of wounds.
Mhm.
Of course, I've benefited greatly from psychedelic medicines,
Yeah.
but not every facilitator is an appropriate facilitator for this kind of work because I have witnessed in integration circles, in retreats, facilitators who don't hold both,
Mm.
honoring your suffering and honoring the truth of how things, happened or didn't happen. That's a delicate balance.
Yeah.
And so I feel like I would ask a facilitator, whether it's an individual therapist, a group therapist, a medicine healer, what's your conceptualization of the development of mental health issues?
Easy question. Let's see where they take that. Yeah.
Right? Right. And if they talk about attachment in the old fashioned way,
Yeah.
I'm going to walk on.
Yeah.
I don't need that. And I'm not doing that to my mother. She suffered enough, in terms of cultural expectations that are completely fucking unreasonable.
Yeah.
And I've suffered enough from the internalization of that, and no more. Not
Mhm.
doing it. So those are some ideas. Far from perfect.
Sure. Yeah. And I appreciate them, right? I think attachment plus systems perspective, right? That's what I'm hearing. And
Mhm.
I decided to take some electives in feminist therapy, which seems to have that sort of pull
Cool.
together. Yeah, I really loved that. And it seemed it talked not too much about attachment, but relational patterns and then larger system theories and how that is also there. So maybe that could be another perspective that's kind of,
Oh,
yeah, I really loved that.
yes.
Yeah. And at least when I was taught in school, they made us take all the different perspectives, the main ones, right? So we took like psychodynamic, we took cognitive behavioral therapy, and then systems as well, and existential humanistic. So I didn't get just one, which it made me at least think much broader, probably, than hopefully, when you were in school and being taught these
Yes.
more like it's just the mom and it's the mom and only the mom, right?
Yeah.
So I like to hopefully be a beacon of light that at least some of the programs now are doing a little bit more of a wider perspective that will give people hopefully that level of like cultural consciousness to say it's much larger than just that issue specifically. We hope,
Nicole,
right?
it's beautiful. Yeah, no, I think that's really beautiful and encouraging, and it does give me hope. So I thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, of
When I
course.
was a prof a number of years ago back in Canada, it was really cool because the university where I worked, they required that every class have Indigenous content.
Mm,
And I would love for that to be true across clinical psychology coursework, you know, because there are going to be some tensions,
Sure.
very healthy tensions that I think will help to improve the field of psychology.
Absolutely.
Because a lot of what we, you know, say and do as a field, that wouldn't fly in other more traditional, intact, you know, cultures. So,
Yep. That and the body. I think that's another
oh my
area
God,
that
the
we
body,
we've never, yeah, we don't have any
right?
classes on that. And again, I'll throw down for the need for pleasure, right? And the need for sex, because in
Yes.
reality, when a mother is not connected to her pleasure, I think that impacts everything. I think that impacts
Oh my gosh.
everything. And so I will throw down for the rest of my career on the need for that and the ways that we can integrate that, you know, shadow, dark, whatever light we want to call those
Whatever.
things. You know what I mean? The ability to have pleasure in our bodies at baseline and connection in all of its different forms is 100% crucial in terms of your ability to be a parent, right? And love and have that pleasure. So it's just, there's a lot to do
Oh
in
my
our
gosh, I'm so
lifetimes.
happy you keep bringing it up because you can tell that I still have some internalized structures of oppression here. Because I'm like, oh my God, I would have never thought of that. Just like, wow, that seems like way too much like whipped cream.
Yeah,
And
well,
no, it's not. It's a fundamental ingredient. And so thank you
totally.
for
Yeah,
helping me
sure.
to refine my intentions list for my personal work.
For sure. I mean, it's really
Yeah,
fascinating. There's very little data on it, which is, you know, its own thing. But from what I see, there's data talking about how, like, men's, you know, it's very gendered, but like men's sexual drive in long-term relationship stays pretty stable. And then women's drops off at a pretty like intense rate. So I find
mm,
that really interesting, even that gender difference, right? And I think a lot of it we could point to some of the things you talked about, right? Of being the primary caretaker, not having enough space, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I think there might be even more tucked in that, you know, as someone who's non-monogamous, who's kinky, who's queer, you know, there's a lot of
yeah,
play that I'm doing in ways that, you know, women of 100 years ago couldn't have even, you know, even now, many women can't even conceptualize doing without it
right.
being like you're a slut and a whore in a negative way, a non-empowering way. So I just think there's a
Yeah.
lot tied up in that.
Well, you're making me think about like pleasure as also a vehicle for overall flexibility.
Yeah.
You
Yes.
know, like it really is such a fascinating tool, if you will. I mean, it's a birthright, but if I'm thinking about it neurobiologically, it also, I think, promotes cognitive and emotional flexibility,
Yeah,
which is one of the building blocks of resilience. So,
sure.
hey, guess what, Nicole, not that you need me to tell you, because
Ah!
clearly you have been leading this charge. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Can I offer a couple little
It is. It's
thoughts?
helpful
I think you're
though.
onto something, girl.
Ah! Yeah, and I mean, I think I see that in the psychedelic assisted psychotherapy work, right? You have
Yeah.
that client who's, you know, self-deprecating, super judgmental of themselves, and then they come in and they have that session and they're like, "Wow, I feel good. I feel good about myself. That was actually really pleasurable," right? And it's just even deconstructing that narrative that healing has to be painful, right? You can come and have a psychedelic assisted therapy session that brings you into a state of pleasure, and the way that that creates then more space for you to even think differently about your life and all that. So I'm sure you've seen
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
For sure. You know, it's so true. Like people have joyful experiences on psychedelics. They feel like they're not doing it right, but no,
Yep.
they're creating pathways to make that more accessible and to make it something that they privilege more often, you know, as a right, you know, the right to pleasure, the right to joy, the right to
Yeah.
peace, the right to calm,
Yeah.
you know, amazing. Love it.
Yeah. Yeah, which is funny because like cognitive behavioral therapy, like the fourth wave was coming in, and I guess they were saying that like they're going to the space of like asking clients like, when was the last time you were happy? And when was the last time you were thriving? And trying to get people back into that paradigm. So I'm like,
Mm.
here we go. People are starting to think differently about the ways that we can heal, right?
And grow.
Yeah.
I know, you know, it's like I love one of the legacies of Roland Griffiths, oh, who just passed. what a loss, is that he was really, really wanting us to not just think about healing, but human flourishing. And I think that holding both at all times is so important. That we can both be healing and flourishing, and that they're intricately related. But we don't talk enough about the flourishing part.
That's part of why I started this podcast,
Aww.
when I'm doing the sexual assault healing work, like what does it mean to get to a state of pleasure, right? What does that mean? And we don't, as a society, all the forces huge on that one, right? So thinking about what does it mean to go from that state to a state of flourishing and a pleasurable life, I think that the field of psychology is significantly lacking in that area. So it's part of why I started having more conversations on the podcast with sex workers and other, somatic educators, other sort of people from all different professions that could speak to it. And, in many ways, you've spoken to another one, which is, the mother wound, right? And the mother blame. And if you have that blame and all of that, like tapping into your pleasure is not going to be as accessible. And it's an important thing to talk about and to dismantle and keep that wider perspective of the systems and how that's impacting our access to pleasure.
Mm-hmm. Wow, I'm going to take this forward with me, this particular aspect of the conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, check back in with me. Let me know where you get to.
What a gift.
Yeah. Well, I want to hold some space as we come towards the end of our time in case there is anything you wanted to share with the listeners. Otherwise, I have a closing question I can guide us towards.
Great. I mean, the only thing I would add was that we are still recruiting participants for the Love Project research survey. Basically, if anyone has had a profound experience of love under the effect of a psychedelic, we encourage them to visit our website, www.psychedeliclove.org, and click on the survey tab. And the survey is about 30 minutes. Many people have shared that it's been quite a positive experience to kind of reflect on a profound experience of love. But we're trying to legitimize the concept of love as a healing technology so that we can more formally integrate it into psychedelic therapy, but also into conventional therapy models, including broad-based healthcare delivery. So that would be my only, plug.
Yeah. How many times can I put in a submission? Right?
Oh my gosh. Thank you.
Yeah, totally.
I mean, probably just once, but I would really appreciate it because we really want to learn from people's experiences of love. I feel we have a lot to learn about love, especially the integration of it in healing.
Very, very powerful. Well, if it feels good to you, I'll guide us towards our closing question. Okay. Well, then the one question I ask each guest is, what is one thing that you wish other people knew was more normal?
That it is normal to have needs. Yeah. I'm still grappling with that reality. And in our very individualistic, survival-based culture, I feel like there's so many messages that if we have needs, there's something wrong with us, but it's so normal, no matter what.
Yeah. And that if it's, if you haven't had the space to express those needs in the past, right, it feels uncomfortable to state those. And that can be really hard.
And if you're under-resourced and not sufficiently supported and you have a high degree of need, that's normal in those circumstances too, and you deserve to get help and support. So keep trying, keep knocking on those doors until the right ones are enough of the doors opened for you. You deserve it.
Very, very powerful. It was such a joy to have you on the podcast today.
Oh, thank you so much, Nicole. And thank you so much for your work. You are a lovely human being.
Thank you. Thank you. It's very sweet of you.
What a joy.
Yeah, I want to ask you too, where do you want to plug so people can find your project, find your work, anything that you want to share at the end so people can connect with you?
Sure. So I have a website, www.dradelafrance.com, which if I could go back and remove the DR, I totally would, because it's another system of oppression.
Yeah.
These titles And then, the Love Project can be found at www.psychedelichealing.org. So that's another place where they can find us work.
Lovely. Well, thank you so much for sharing your story and all of your work today with me and the listeners. If you enjoyed today's episode, then leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to your podcast. And head on over to modernanarchypodcast.com to get resources and learn more about all the things we talked about on today's episode. I want to thank you for tuning in, and I will see you all next week.